Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
Godric's hollow slumbered beneath a thick blanket of snow that sparkled in the cold light of a full moon. Winter had been particularly harsh this year, transforming the ancient wizarding settlement into a crystal stage set, frozen in frosty silence. The air was so transparent and sharp that every breath felt like a gulp of ice water, and every exhale turned into a thick cloud of steam that instantly dissolved into the darkness. Hermione Granger stood by a low wrought iron gate, pulling her warm cloak of heavy dark blue wool tighter around herself. Her dragonhide boots creaked softly, packing down the snow that no one seemed to have cleared here for several weeks. She raised a hand, protected by a thick leather glove, and looked up at the house towering before her. It was no ordinary cottage, of which there were many in the hollow. Barnaby Tock's house resembled a vast, slightly tilting chest made of dark wood, to which someone had jokingly attached high-pointed roofs and a multitude of chimneys of various shapes. The windows were dark, like closed eyes, yet Hermione felt that the building was not empty. It hummed. It was not the sound of voices or footsteps, but a low, rhythmic vibration that could be felt through the soles of one's feet, even through the layer of snow. Hermione sighed, releasing another small cloud of steam into the air. At 35, she had learned to appreciate quiet evenings at home with a cup of tea and ministry reports, but her position as deputy head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement sometimes required her personal presence at sites classified as, quote, potentially unstable Class A magical artifacts. The home of the late Mr. Tock, a clockmaker known throughout Britain but a recluse by nature, was exactly such an object. Well then, she whispered to herself, breaking the crystal silence of the street. Just a property assessment, no adventures. Just checking to make sure nothing blows up before morning. She pushed the gate. Instead of the usual creak of hinges, the metal emitted a sound like the chime of a tuning fork, a pure, drawn-out ding that slowly faded in the frosty air. Hermione frowned. That was already odd. She drew her wand, her familiar vine wood shaft, and illuminated the path ahead with a Lumos charm. The path to the house was perfectly smooth, covered not in snow, but in a strange layer of frost that arranged itself in geometric patterns resembling gears. Hermione walked slowly, her gaze sliding over the building's facade. She noticed that the gutters were made of copper that had not turned green with time, but shone as if freshly polished. The weather vane on the roof, shaped like a heron standing on one leg, did not move, though the wind at that height ought to have been swaying it. Reaching the massive oak doors, Hermione stopped. There was no handle, nor a keyhole, only a large brass dial in the center, its hands frozen at the 12 o'clock mark. Of course, Hermione murmured, feeling a slight irritation, mixed with professional interest. It would be too simple to just walk in through the door. She raised her wand, intending to utter an unlocking charm, but stopped. Her logic, honed by years of working with curses and complex mechanisms, suggested that Alohomora would be about as useful here as a soup fork. Barnaby Tock was not just a wizard, he was a mechanic. His magic was material, bound to physical laws just as tightly as to magical currents. Hermione stowed her wand and removed her glove. Her fingers touched the cold metal of the dial. She pressed gently on the center, where the hands were attached. The metal was warm, as if alive. She tried to turn the minute hand. It yielded with a heavy, satisfying click, click. The hand moved 1 minute forward. Click. Another minute. Hermione listened. From inside the door came a noise like the movement of 1,000 tiny metal legs. She continued to rotate the hand until she heard the loud strike of a gong somewhere deep within the house. The doors shuddered and slowly, majestically opened inward, releasing the smell of old paper, machine oil, and beeswax into the frosty night. Hermione stepped across the threshold and found herself in another world. If outside the winter silence reigned, inside the house the air was filled with sound. It was not a chaotic noise, but a complex, multi-layered symphony. Ticking. Thousands of clocks ticked simultaneously, but not in unison. Some hurried, emitting a nervous tick-tick-tick. Others counted time with dignity and slowness. Tock, tock, while a third group rustled barely audibly, like sand slipping through fingers. The entrance hall was spacious, with a high ceiling that was lost in darkness. The walls were hung with clocks of every conceivable shape and size. There were huge grandfather clocks of mahogany inlaid with mother-of-pearl, elegant mantel clocks with gilding, cuckoos that peered out of their wooden houses but remained silent, merely blinking their glass eyes. There were even clocks that seemed to be made of liquid flowing down the wall, forming numbers. Hermione took a few steps forward, and the floorboards creaked beneath her. This sound seemed alien in the kingdom of mechanical rhythm. She lit Lumos again, raising her wand higher. The light reflected off hundreds of brass, copper, and silver surfaces, creating a whimsical play of light spots on the walls that moved in time with the pendulums. "Mr. Tock?" she called out, though she knew there would be no answer. The owner had died a week ago, leaving this house and its secrets to the ministry, as he had no heirs. Hermione walked further, towards the central hall. It was warmer here than outside, but this warmth was dry and somehow artificial. A fire burned in the huge fireplace. Hermione approached to warm her hands and froze. The flame was motionless. Tongues of fire were frozen in the moment of their dance, resembling masterfully carved pieces of amber. They radiated heat, light pulsed softly inside them, but the flame itself did not flicker, did not change shape. The logs in the fireplace did not blacken or crumble into ash. It was a moment of burning, torn from time and stretched into eternity. "Interesting," Hermione whispered, leaning closer. Her scientific curiosity instantly displaced her fatigue. She reached out a hand towards the fire but did not touch it. The heat was real, but the sensation of time near the fireplace was distorted. It seemed to her that her hand was moving slower, as if through thick syrup. She jerked her palm back sharply. "Stasis?" she asked herself. No, too complex for ordinary stasis. Stasis stops processes. But this continues the process without its completion. She straightened up and looked around more carefully. Now that the initial shock had passed, she began to notice other details that did not fit into the usual picture of the world. Dust motes danced in the beam of light from her wand, but they did not fall down nor swirl chaotically from the movement of air. They hung motionless, forming perfect spirals. Hermione swept her hand through one such spiral. The motes parted, letting her hand pass, and instantly returned to their places as soon as she removed her palm. A local gravitational anomaly, or Hermione bit her lip. Her brain began to build hypotheses, discarding one after another. Or time here has a different density. She moved further down the corridor that led deeper into the house. The walls here were lined with dark panels, and every step Hermione took echoed unnaturally loud, as if she were walking inside a giant guitar. To her right, she saw a door ajar leading to a study. Stepping inside, she found herself in a room cluttered with blueprints. Paper was everywhere, on the desk, on the floor, pinned to the curtains. Hermione picked up one of the sheets. It was a diagram of some incredibly complex mechanism. Lines intersected, forming mazes. Numbers were written in a small beaded hand. But the strangest thing was that the blueprints were moving. Ink flowed slowly across the paper, changing the configuration of parts right before Hermione's eyes. She peered at the notes in the margins. Attempt 487. Synchronization failed. The pendulum lags by 0.003 seconds. This is enough to lose the memory of a smile. Hermione set the sheet aside. Her heart began to beat a little faster. To lose the memory of a smile. It sounded not like a technical problem, but like something deeply personal, tragic. Barnaby Tock was not just making clocks. He was trying to control something that was subject to neither magic nor mechanics. Suddenly, the ticking in the house changed. If before it had been a chaotic noise, now the rhythm became synchronous. Thousands of mechanisms struck in a single second. Tick, silence. Absolute, ringing silence that lasted exactly 1 second. Tock, silence again. Hermione felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. This rhythm resembled the heartbeat of a huge beast that had woken up at her presence. Hermione froze, pressing a hand to her chest as if trying to calm her own heart, which had suddenly decided to compete in volume with the mechanical rhythm of the house. The silence that followed the synchronous strike of 1,000 pendulums was unnatural. It pressed on the ears like a depth of water. And then, just as suddenly as it had disappeared, the sound returned. But now, it was not merely ticking. It was the sound of a great, complex process, as if somewhere deep within the walls, giant millstones had begun to turn. She stepped out of the study back into the corridor. Now the shadows seemed longer, and the light from her wand dimmer, as if the darkness around had become thicker, material. Hermione felt a barely perceptible draft that smelled of ozone and old dust. It pulled her deeper into the house, towards the large double doors at the very end of the corridor, which had previously been hidden in gloom. Intuition, honed by years of dangerous adventures, screamed that she should turn around and leave. Walk out into the snow, disapparate to the ministry, and return here with a team of unspeakables. But logic, her main weapon and her curse, suggested otherwise. If the anomaly was related to time, then any delay could be fatal. Perhaps what was happening here was already affecting the outside world. She approached the high doors. There were no handles on them, only a complex bas-relief depicting the phases of the moon and the movement of planets. Hermione pushed the leaves with her palms. They opened, soundlessly, surprisingly easily, as if they had been waiting for her. What she saw behind the doors made her forget to breathe. It was the workshop. But calling this hall simply a workshop would be an insult. It was a cathedral of mechanics. The room had no ceiling. It went up into the darkness, where beams, chains, and ropes intertwined. The walls were completely covered with shelves, drawers, and niches filled with tools whose purpose Hermione could not even guess. But the main thing here was the grand clock. It occupied the entire far wall, a colossal mechanism of dull bronze and silver, no less than 20 feet in diameter. Its dial was transparent, made of rock crystal, and through it, the insides were visible. Hundreds of gears, cogwheels, springs, and levers, interlocked in a complex dead dance. Dead, because the grand clock was standing still. While the rest of the small clocks in the house ticked and made noise, this giant was absolutely motionless. Its hands, long spears of blued steel, were frozen in a position that did not correspond to any real time. Both pointed down, to a point where on a normal dial the number 6 would be, but here the symbol of an inverted 8 was engraved, the sign of infinity, or in this context, eternal return. Hermione walked slowly down the aisle between work tables, cluttered with parts. Here lay a disassembled mechanical owl, there, a pile of springs resembling snakes. She felt a gaze upon her. Looking up, she saw a row of porcelain dolls on one of the shelves. They did not move, but their glass eyes seemed to track her every step. She approached the foot of the grand clock. Cold emanated from it, so intense that the steam from Hermione's mouth instantly turned into ice crystals that fell tinkling to the floor. "So, you are the heart of this problem," she whispered, addressing the mechanism as a living being. Hermione raised her wand. She needed to run a diagnostic, a simple spell to detect magical nodes. She made a sharp movement with her wrist. Revelio Magica. Instead of the usual blue flash or vibration, something impossible happened. From the tip of her wand, magic poured out like thick, luminous syrup of a violet color. It did not fly towards the clock but fell heavily to the floor, splashing in slow, viscous drops. Hermione watched in horror as the spell flowed over her boots, causing no harm but performing no function either. It simply gathered in a puddle at her feet and began to slowly evaporate, turning into silvery smoke. She recoiled, nearly dropping her wand. "That's impossible," she whispered, and her voice trembled. "Magic is energy. It cannot have mass. It cannot obey gravity in such a way. Unless the laws of physics themselves were altered in this room." Hermione recalled old treatises on time turners she had read in her 3rd year, and more complex works from the Department of Mysteries she had gained access to as a ministry employee. There was a theory that time is not just a dimension but a 5th element, capable of changing the aggregate state of magic. If time here was compressed to such a degree, then magic simply froze, becoming heavy, inert. This meant one thing: she was unarmed. Traditional charms would not work here. She could not defend herself, could not disapparate, could not even send a Patronus signal. Hermione felt cold sweat run down her back under her warm cloak. She looked at the grand clock. Now it seemed to her not majestic, but sinister. Its motionless gears resembled the teeth of a trap that had just snapped shut. She needed to leave. Immediately. She turned on her heel, trying to maintain calm. Panic is the enemy. Logic is a friend. Plan of action. Exit the house. Retreat to a safe distance where magic becomes gaseous again. Call for backup. Surround the perimeter with protective barriers. She walked quickly towards the exit of the workshop. Her footsteps echoed too loudly in the silence that had reigned in the hall again, when the small clock suddenly fell silent. Now, as she walked towards the doors, it seemed to her that the distance had increased. The doors, which had been only 20 paces away, now looked as if she had to run to them. Spatial distortion, she stated through clenched teeth, quickening her pace. A classic defense mechanism of closed loops. She was almost running. When her hand touched the cool surface of the door, she exhaled with relief. She pushed the leaves. They opened. Hermione stepped across the threshold, expecting to see the familiar dark corridor with panels. But instead of the corridor, the workshop was before her again. She was standing in the exact same spot she had just left, at the foot of the grand clock. The same tables with parts, the same porcelain dolls, the same cold. Hermione froze. She slowly turned around. Behind her were the doors through which she had just entered. "Calm down, Granger," she said aloud, and her voice sounded hollow as if in a barrel. "It's just an illusion. Or a Mobius strip." She walked towards the doors again. This time, she carefully monitored her sensations. She crossed the threshold. A momentary dizziness, similar to what happens during a failed apparition. And she was standing before the grand clock again, staring at the inverted 8. "No," she breathed out. She rushed to the nearest window. It was tall, narrow, covered in cobwebs. Hermione wiped the glass with the sleeve of her cloak and looked outside. What she saw made her legs give way. She had to lean on the windowsill to keep from falling. Outside the window was Godric's Hollow, but it was not the landscape she had left 10 minutes ago. The snow was not falling. Large white flakes hung in the air, absolutely motionless, forming a solid white curtain. A branch of the old oak tree growing under the window was bent from a gust of wind, but did not straighten. A bird, it was an owl, hung in flight, wings spread, like a stuffed animal suspended on invisible threads. The world outside the house had stopped. Time out there had frozen. But here, inside, it continued to move, only somehow wrongly, sickly. Hermione stepped back from the window. In her head, despite the fear, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Barnaby Tock hadn't just been experimenting with clocks. He had created a time pocket. The house was isolated from the outside world, torn from the general flow of reality. And now that she had entered, she had become part of this autonomous mechanism. She could not leave because outside did not exist for this house right now. There was only inside. Suddenly, the grand clock behind her made a sound. It was a loud grinding of metal on metal that made Hermione's teeth ache. She spun around sharply. The large hand shuddered. It slowly, overcoming incredible resistance, crawled upward. Crack. The sound was like ice cracking on a lake. The hand moved a millimeter. And along with this movement, the walls of the room shuddered. Hermione noticed the table, with tools to her right, slide an inch closer to the center. She looked to the left. The shelves had also become closer. "Oh, Merlin's beard," she whispered, realizing the terrible truth. It wasn't just a trap. It was a press. Every time the clock tried to make a move, the space inside the house contracted. Time, having nowhere to flow, began to devour space. Energy of compression. If the mechanism wasn't fixed or stopped, or she didn't know yet exactly what needed to be done, but she understood the consequences. Soon the walls of this room would converge at a single point, with her inside. Hermione closed her eyes and took a deep breath, forcing her brain to switch from victim mode to problem-solving mode. She remembered Dumbledore's words. Happiness can be found, even in the darkest of times, if one only remembers to turn on the light. Here, she couldn't turn on the light with magic. Here, she needed to turn on her mind. "All right, Barnaby," she said loudly into the emptiness of the room. Her voice sounded firm, though her hands were still trembling. "You wanted to play with time. Let's play, but be warned. I was always the top student in my year, and I do not intend to become part of your interior decor." She walked to the nearest table, swept a pile of small parts off it, and unrolled the old, yellowed blueprint she had found in the study earlier. She took a simple Muggle self-inking quill from her pocket, the only tool that worked reliably here, and bent over the paper. Around her, thousands of clocks began to tick again, picking up a frantic, uneven rhythm, as if mocking her. The grand clock behind her back was preparing for the next strike, the next step into oblivion, but Hermione was no longer looking at them. She was looking at the diagram of gears, and in her eyes burned the spark of determination that Harry and Ron knew so well. a spark that meant Hermione Granger had accepted the challenge. She was locked in a shrinking box, without magic, without help, just the way she liked it. With a sound like thunder, something shifted deep within the mechanism, and the house shuddered again, becoming a little smaller. Winter outside the window watched her with millions of frozen snowflake eyes. The night was just beginning. The walls were closing in. It wasn't the slow constriction of a room in a Muggle horror film. It was a convulsive, jerky motion. The workshop shuddered with every click-clack of the invisible mechanisms, and with each spasm, the space shrank by an inch. Shelves of tools creaked, bending under invisible pressure. Glass jars filled with screws exploded, showering the floor with sharp shards. Hermione stood amidst this chaos, gripping a heavy monkey wrench she had snatched from a workbench. Her wand was tucked into her belt. Here, in the heart of a mechanical anomaly, a piece of iron was more useful than the most complex of charms. "Think, Granger, think," she whispered, her eyes darting feverishly around the room. Her gaze shifted from the grand clock to the approaching walls. If space is contracting, there must be a piston or a drive pushing these walls. It's physics. Brute, relentless mechanics. She rushed to the left wall, where the wooden panels had already begun to crack, revealing dark metal behind them. Through a fissure, she saw movement. There, deep within the wall, a massive worm screw was slowly turning, pulling the wall towards itself. It was lubricated with black, thick grease that smelled of burnt sugar. Hermione ran to the shaft. She couldn't stop it with magic, but she could create an obstruction. "Engorgio!" she shouted, pointing her wand at the wrench in her left hand. It was a simple spell, one of the first they had learned. Here, in this air thick with time. It worked with a delay. A beam of magic struck the wrench. It vibrated as if alive and began to slowly swell, increasing in size. The metal groaned as it stretched. When the wrench became the size of a good shovel, Hermione, straining every muscle, swung and drove it with force between the teeth of the worm screw. Screech! The sound was like the scream of a wounded dragon. Metal struck metal. Sparks showered down, blinding and hot. The shaft shuddered, tried to turn further, grinding the obstruction, but the wrench, reinforced by the engorgement charm, held. The gear jammed. The wall stopped 1/2 meter from the table where Hermione had just been standing. The house responded with a long, disappointed hum. Somewhere above, something banged, and the ticking of the smaller clocks fell out of rhythm, turning into a disorganized clatter. Hermione exhaled, wiping sweat from her forehead. Her hands trembled from the strain. She had bought a little time, perhaps a few minutes, until the mechanism found a way around or crushed the obstacle. "Now the exit," she said firmly. The doors she had tried to leave through earlier were blocked by the shifted wall, but the crack into which she had jammed the wrench had widened from the impact. Beyond it she saw not a corridor, but a maintenance tunnel. These were the guts of the house, the space between rooms where chains and pipes ran. Hermione squeezed through the gap. It was dark here, with only a faint phosphorescent glow coming from some glass bulbs fixed to the ceiling. The air was stale and hot. She found herself in a labyrinth, but it was not a static maze of stone. The walls here moved. They were gigantic cogwheels, slowly rotating, transmitting motion from the foundation to the roof. The floor beneath her feet was a grate, and through it, Hermione saw an endless abyss below, where giant pendulums swung in the darkness. "This isn't just a house," she muttered, stepping carefully onto the unsteady grating. "It's one solid clockwork mechanism. And the rooms are just decorations attached to the gears." She moved forward, guided by the logic of an engineer. If the grand clock in the workshop is the dial, then the energy source, the mainspring or weights, must be at the center of mass. She needed to find the center. Suddenly, the space around her changed. She stepped onto a platform, and it began to descend. But not down, backwards. Things around her began to alter. Rust on the pipes vanished right before her eyes, turning into shiny metal. Dust flew into the air and gathered into dense clumps of dirt, which then disappeared. Entropy in reverse, Hermione guessed, grabbing the railing. I'm approaching the epicenter of the anomaly. Time flows in the opposite direction here. It was dangerous. If she stayed here too long, her own cells might begin to grow younger, erasing gained experience, scars, memory. She had to move fast. The platform stopped near an arched doorway, leading into a circular room. Unlike the maintenance tunnel, this room looked almost normal, albeit somewhat old-fashioned. It was a library archive. But the books here did not stand on shelves. They flew in the air, opening and closing like birds flapping their wings. In the middle of the room, behind a large oak desk, sat no one. There stood a chair on which lay a robe that retained the shape of the person who had just been sitting there. A cup of tea steamed on the desk. The steam rose upwards and froze in bizarre rings. Hermione approached the desk. Next to the cup lay a thick journal bound in leather. It was chained to the table by a thin silver chain. She opened it. It was not just a diary. It was the logbook of an experiment called Chronos Zero. Barnaby Tock's handwriting was nervous. The letters jumped. The ink was smeared in places, as if written by a trembling hand. Entry 42. Today I managed to catch a second. I placed it in a jar. It beats against the glass, like a moth. It is a second of pain. I cannot release it, otherwise it will become part of my life again. Hermione turned a few pages. Entry 108. Mechanical magic is more stable than verbal. Words disappear as soon as you speak them. A gear remains. If I build a mechanism precise enough, I can catch the fabric of the past with its teeth and pull it towards me. Hermione read, and a picture of tragedy formed before her eyes. Barnaby Tock was not a mad scientist seeking power. He was a broken man. The last entry was made quite recently, perhaps a few hours before his death. I found the error. It is not in the calculations. It is in me. I am trying to return the day Eleanor went to the lake. I want to stop her, but every time I start the cycle, I erase the very reason why I am doing it. I forget that she died, and therefore I do not start the machine. And when I do not start it, she dies. It is a closed circle. I created hell, thinking I was building heaven. Now the house wants to complete the cycle. It wants to take me too. The key. I hid the key in a moment when everything was still good. But I cannot reach it. I am too old. Eleanor, Hermione said softly. She remembered the obituary in the Daily Prophet many years ago. The wife of the famous clockmaker, drowned in the Black Lake during a winter walk. Her body was never found under the ice. Now everything fell into place. The house was a monument to grief, turned into a time machine. And this machine had broken, dragging its creator into the eternity he so desired. Suddenly, the desk under Hermione's hands shuddered. The ink on the pages of the journal began to spread, turning into black blood. The books flying in the air dropped like stones to the floor. Hermione, she heard a whisper. She spun around sharply. There was no one in the room. But the whisper sounded again, this time right by her ear. Run, it is rebuilding. Hermione didn't wait for a third warning. She tore the last page from the journal, shoved it into her pocket, and rushed to the exit. At that same moment, the floor in the archive began to split apart. The floorboards stood on end, turning into sharp teeth. The room was trying to digest the foreign object. Hermione leaped from the archive, just as the massive oak doors slammed shut, cutting off the sound of crushing furniture and groaning parquet. She found herself on a narrow metal catwalk suspended over the dark abyss of the maintenance shaft. Behind her, the wall where the door had been simply vanished, dissolving into a grey mist, leaving behind only the smooth surface of a huge steel sheet vibrating with tension. She breathed heavily, clutching the crumpled sheet from the diary to her chest. Her heart hammered somewhere in her throat, but there was no time to rest. The labyrinth was changing. Now that she understood the nature of this place, she saw it differently. It wasn't chaos. It was a process of reverse assembly. The house was trying to return to the state of before the mistake. Before Eleanor's death. And Hermione was a superfluous part, dust in the clockwork mechanism that the system was trying to get rid of. She looked down. The abyss was filled with movement. Gigantic cogwheels, each the size of a Quidditch pitch, slowly rotated in the thick darkness. Chains as thick as the trunk of an ancient oak ran between them. And all of this was moving upwards. Towards her. "You won't erase me," she whispered, hiding the sheet in the inner pocket of her cloak. "I'm too stubborn for that." Hermione moved forward along the catwalk. Her path lay through a forest of pistons that rhythmically rose and fell, releasing jets of hot steam. She had to calculate every step. 1. Piston up. 2. Path clear. 3. Dash. She slipped under a massive copper pipe a second before the steel cylinder descended into place, with a dull thud that rattled her teeth. Suddenly, the catwalk beneath her feet swayed. Metal creaked, changing shape. The railing began to retract into the structure. Hermione realized the platform she was standing on was transforming into something else, perhaps a part of a wall or a stairstep. She looked up. Above her, about 50 feet away, a dim beam of light was visible, breaking through a gap in the mechanisms. It was the center, the heart of the house, where all lines of force converged. But there were no stairs leading there. "Fine," she said, estimating the distance. "Physics, kinetics, momentum." She stowed her wand. It was almost useless here. Hermione walked to the edge of the disappearing platform and looked at a chain slowly crawling upwards a few meters away. It was covered in grease, slippery and dirty. Hermione Granger, Minister for Magic, war heroine, a woman used to solving problems with intellect, now had to rely on the strength of her hands. She took a deep breath, calculated the trajectory and jumped. The wind whistled in her ears. Her fingers dug into the cold, slippery metal of a chain link. The jerk sent a jolt of pain through her shoulders. She nearly slipped, but held on, wrapping her legs around the link. Her cloak got tangled, hindering her movements. Hermione, without hesitation, unfastened the brooch and let the heavy wool fabric fall into the abyss. Now she was left in comfortable trousers and a shirt that did not restrict movement. The chain pulled her upwards. Mechanisms floated past her, becoming increasingly bizarre. She saw clocks showing time on other planets. She saw glass spheres with rain falling inside. She saw mechanical birds disassembling themselves into screws and reassembling again. The higher she rose, the stronger the pressure became. It wasn't physical pressure, but mental. The air became thick with memories that did not belong to her. Alien images flashed through her mind. The scent of lavender and a woman's laughter. sunlight glinting on lake ice. A desperate scream cut off by the gurgling of water. Cold. The unbearable cold of loss. Hermione shook her head, chasing away the visions. "This isn't mine," she hissed through her teeth. "Get out of my head." She reached the top point where the chain bent over a huge shaft. She had to jump onto a stationary platform. She swung herself and let go. She landed hard, rolling across a wooden floor covered in a thick layer of dust. She was there. This room was different from the rest. It was quiet here. No ticking, no grinding. The room was round, located, judging by everything, under the very dome of the highest tower. The walls were transparent, huge stained glass windows, but there was no street behind them. Behind them swirled the grey fog of time, in which lightning bolts of events that never happened occasionally flashed. In the middle of the room hung the heart. It was a complex structure of counterweights. 2 huge scale pans, suspended on the thinnest threads, balanced in perfect equilibrium. On one pan lay a handful of white sand. On the other, a black raven feather. They did not move, but Hermione saw that the system was incomplete. Between the pans of the scales, at the fulcrum, a void gaped. There should have been a mechanism there that triggered the movement. A regulator. Of course. Hermione breathed, getting to her feet. For time to pass, the equilibrium must be disturbed. Stasis is the death of time. You need an impulse. She took a step towards the scales, and suddenly the air before her thickened. A figure wove itself from the fog. It wasn't a ghost in the usual sense. It was a hologram, a recording, a projection of memory. Barnaby Tock. He looked younger than in the newspaper photos. His hair wasn't grey yet, and a fanatical glint of hope bordered on madness in his eyes. He didn't see Hermione. He was locked in his moment. The ghost of Barnaby walked around the scales, muttering under his breath. "Almost ready. Just a little more. If I can fix the point of no return." He held something small in his hands that shone with a dull blue light. Hermione squinted. It was a key, but not a metal one. It looked as if it had been carved from a single piece of sapphire or frozen ice. "I will hide it where time has no power," the ghost murmured. "In there, 0 second. So that no one can start the mechanism before I am ready." He walked to the wall where an old, broken wall clock without hands hung. He opened its case and placed the key inside, right into the void between the back panel and the mechanism. Then he closed the door, snapped his fingers, and the clock disappeared, dissolved into thin air. The ghost of Barnaby returned to the center of the room, spread his arms like a conductor, and disintegrated into sparks. The loop ended. Hermione was left alone in silence. She knew where the key was. It was in the clock that had disappeared. But disappeared is a relative term in a house where time is a physical dimension. The clock hadn't disappeared in space. It had disappeared in time. Barnaby had sent it to another moment. 0 second, Hermione repeated. The moment before the countdown begins. She approached the spot on the wall where the ghostly clock had just hung. There was only bare brick. She closed her eyes. She needed to think like the house. If time is space, then the past is down or behind, and the future is up or ahead. 0 second is the foundation. It is the beginning. But she was at the top of the tower. It was a paradox. Unless the house really was a Mobius strip. She looked at the scales, sand and feather, heaviness and lightness, matter and memory. Hermione realized what she needed to do. She took out her wand. Magic worked poorly here, but she didn't need complex spells. She needed a simple apparitium, a charm to reveal the invisible. No, she needed to restore the object. She pointed her wand at the empty wall. "Chronos reparo!" she shouted, improvising, pouring into the spell not so much a magical formula as her intention to fix the tear in the temporal fabric. Nothing happened. The wall remained a wall. Wrong. Hermione punched her palm. I'm trying to retrieve an object from the past. But for this house, the past is the present. The key is here. It's just moving faster than I can see it. She pressed her ear to the wall. Tick-tock. Tick-tock, very fast. So fast that the sound merged into a hum. The clock with the key was vibrating at a frequency inaccessible to normal perception. Hermione stepped back. She glanced at a pile of junk in the corner of the room, remnants of previous experiments. An old metronome lay there. Insight struck her. Resonance. She needed to slow down her own perception or speed up the room's vibration to enter into resonance with the hidden object. She grabbed the metronome, placed it on the floor near the wall, wound the spring. Click! She pushed the metronome's pendulum. Tick-tock! She pointed her wand at the metronome. Immobulus! She commanded, but not to stop it, but to create a slowing field around it. The metronome began to tick slower. Tick-tock! She began to slowly, intently turn the tempo regulator on the metronome, trying to find a counter-rhythm to the humming in the wall. It was like cracking a safe, only by ear. Biz. She turned the regulator. BZZ, BZZ, BZZ. The sound in the wall began to break down into separate beats. Hermione felt the space around her begin to tremble. Her teeth ached, her vision blurred. Suddenly, an outline began to emerge on the wall. At first ghostly, translucent, then clearer, a wooden case. Broken glass. The clock was manifesting. It was breaking, falling out of its high-speed stream into her reality. Just a little more, she whispered, sweat pouring into her eyes. The hand holding the wand trembled from the strain. Maintaining the stasis field required colossal effort. Bang! The clock materialized completely, falling from the wall to the floor with a very real crash, raising a cloud of dust. The metronome stopped. Hermione lowered her wand, breathing heavily. She had done it. She had pulled an object out of a time pocket. She fell to her knees beside the broken clock. With trembling fingers, she opened the back cover. There, amidst cobwebs and rust, lay it. The key. It shone with a cold blue light that gave no warmth. It was colder than ice. Hermione reached out. "Don't touch it with bare hands," an inner voice whispered to her, but she knew there was no other way. She grabbed the key. Cold burned her palm like fire. Pain pierced her arm to the very shoulder, but she did not let go. And in that same instant, the world tilted. It wasn't a physical shake. It was a blow to the consciousness. The walls of the room disappeared. The scales disappeared. Hermione suddenly found herself not in the tower, but in the middle of a snowy field. The sun shone brightly, blindingly. She was young. She was 11. She was running towards the Hogwarts Express, dragging a heavy trunk behind her. "No," she said, but her voice was a child's. "This isn't true. I'm an adult. I'm in Tock's house." The vision changed. She is sitting in the Gryffindor common room. Ron is laughing, trying to teach her to play chess. Harry is staring into the fire. Warm. Peaceful. Why does she want to leave here? It's so good here. It's safe here. It's a trap. Hermione's thought beat like a bird in a cage. This is entropy of memory. The key. It's erasing me. She looked at her hand. In the vision, She held not a key, but a quill. She tried to unclench her fingers, but couldn't. Reality was blurring. The house had moved to the next phase of defense. If it couldn't crush her body with walls, it decided to dissolve her mind in happy memories, so she would voluntarily stay here forever, becoming another ghost, another echo. Warmth. It was the first thing Hermione felt, not the dry, chemical heat of magical stasis, nor the scorching heat from working mechanisms. It was a soft, enveloping warmth that only exists in July, when the sun heats old wood and grass. She opened her eyes. Above her stretched an endless blue sky, across which fluffy clouds drifted slowly. Somewhere nearby, a bumblebee buzzed. She was lying on a tartan rug, spread out on the grass. The smell, it was the smell of the garden at the burrow. Phlox, freshly cut grass, and the sweet aroma of treacle tart, which was likely cooling on a windowsill somewhere. "Your move, Hermione," a familiar voice said. She turned her head. Ron was sitting next to her, leaning his back against the trunk of a gnarled apple tree. He looked completely young, just as he had been in their 6th year. His hair burned in the sun, a carefree smile played on his face, and in his hands he held a chess piece, a black knight that was struggling furiously, trying to bite his finger. "Ron," her voice sounded strange, as if she hadn't spoken in a long time. "What are we doing here?" "What do you mean?" he asked in surprise, releasing the knight onto the board. "Waiting for Harry. He went for a fly. You said yourself that today is the perfect day to do nothing. You even hid your books." Hermione tried to sit up, but her body was so relaxed, so heavy with laziness and peace, that she fell back onto the rug. Perfect day. Yes, it really did look like a perfect day. No dark lords, no horcruxes, no ministry reports, no houses compressing time. A disturbing thought flashed through her consciousness, like a shadow from a cloud, but vanished instantly. Why should she worry about some houses? She was here. She was safe. She was happy. Ron leaned towards her, his eyes warm and kind. "You look tired," he said softly. "Sleep a little longer. There's plenty of time. We have all eternity ahead of us." All eternity. That phrase should have sounded soothing, but for some reason it grated on her ears. Hermione frowned. She looked at her hands. They were clean, without traces of ink, without scars from the war, without calluses from a quill, but in her left palm, she was clutching something. She unclenched her fingers. There lay a piece of ice. A small, sharp crystal shining with an unnatural blue light. It did not melt in the sun. Such cold radiated from it that the skin on her palm turned white and covered in frost, yet, for some reason, Hermione felt no pain. Only numbness. "What is that?" asked Ron, his smile suddenly becoming frozen, unnatural. "It is." Hermione focused. Her brain, lulled by the illusion, began to slowly wake up. Logic, her faithful shield and sword, was piercing through the fog of euphoria. "It is a key." "You don't need keys," Ron said insistently. "All doors are open. Leave it. Throw it away." He reached out to take the crystal, and Hermione saw his wrist. The watch on Ron's arm. The hands on it were not moving. She shifted her gaze to the bumblebee, hovering over a clover flower. Its wings fluttered, but it did not move from its spot. The clouds in the sky were frozen in the same shapes as a minute ago. "This isn't a memory," Hermione whispered, and with every word, The picture around her began to fade like an old photograph. Memories are dynamic. They are alive. And this is a still life. It's a trap. Don't do this, Hermione. Ron's voice changed. Now it was not the voice of her friend, but a mechanical grinding disguised as human speech. You are happy here. Why go back to where it is cold? To where you are alone? I am not alone, she said firmly, squeezing the ice crystal so hard that the sharp edges dug into her skin. Pain pierced her hand, sharp and sobering. I have my life, a real life, with pain, mistakes and losses. And I will not trade it for your artificial eternity. She closed her eyes and focused on the cold in her palm. It was her anchor. Finite incantatum, she screamed, putting all her will into the cry. The world exploded. The blue sky cracked like glass. The apple tree crumbled into a pile of rusty gears. Ron melted, turning into a puddle of black oil. Hermione was yanked back into darkness and cold. She fell to her knees, breathing heavily. Her lungs burned with frosty air filled with dust. She was back in the tower. The illusion had lasted perhaps only a few seconds of real time, but here, in the room with the scales, everything had changed. The walls had moved even closer. The space around the central structure had compressed so much that Hermione felt claustrophobic. The stained glass windows were cracked, and thick grey fog, the very substance of time decay, was seeping through them. She looked at her left hand. She was still clutching the key. Now it looked different. It was not just a piece of ice, but an exquisite crystal quill, inside of which pulsed a blue liquid. Eleanor's quill, Hermione guessed. The last thing she wrote with before she left. It is the symbol of her will. Hermione stood up, swaying. She needed to finish what she had started. The scales hung before her, motionless and majestic. On the left pan, white sand, time passing. On the right, a black raven feather, memory of death. She approached the scales. Her hands trembled, but her movements were precise. Balance is a trap, she whispered, remembering the words from the diary. To start life, one must disturb the peace. She would place the crystal quill on the pan with the sand. She carefully lowered the artifact onto the silver surface. The clink was quiet, but in the acoustics of the tower it sounded like a gunshot. The pan shuddered. The crystal quill, despite its small size, turned out to be incredibly heavy. It carried the weight of emotional significance. The pan with the sand dropped sharply. The equilibrium was broken, but instead of starting the mechanism, something unforeseen happened. The scales tipped so violently that the chain holding the pan pulled taut and, with a loud twang, snapped. The pan with the sand and the key flew down into the darkness of the shaft. No, Hermione screamed, rushing to the edge. She managed to see the pan catch on a protrusion of a huge gear some 3 floors below. It was stuck. The mechanism tried to turn but jammed. The house shook so violently that Hermione fell to the floor. Plaster rained down from the ceiling. She heard a sound that made the blood run cold in her veins, the sound of metal tearing. I disturbed the balance, but didn't restore the coupling, flashed through her mind. The system has gone haywire. There is energy, but no transmission. Everything is going to fly apart now. Hermione crawled to the edge of the opening where the stairs used to be, and now, just a chasm filled with mechanisms. She saw the problem. The main shaft, the spine of the house, was disconnected. The explosion on the scales had shifted the transmission coupling. The upper part of the shaft, where she was spinning wildly fast, while the lower part, where the grand clock was, stood dead still. And between them, in the gap, A magical field sparked, ready to explode. She needed to connect them, physically, manually. Hermione stood at the edge of the fracture, looking into the mechanical hell beneath her feet. The upper part of the shaft spun at a frantic speed, spraying sparks like small comets, while the lower part, which should have driven the grand clock, remained dead and motionless. Between them was 1.5 meters of emptiness. 1.5 meters separating this world from collapse. Connection, she muttered, feverishly scanning the platform. I need a coupling, something that can withstand the torque. Her gaze fell on a massive chain hanging from the ceiling, swinging from the vibration of the house. The links were as thick as her arm, made of goblin silver, strong, yet flexible. It was a chance. The only chance. Hermione stowed her wand. What was needed here was not the precision of a wizard, but brute strength and agility. She ran to the chain, grabbed it with both hands, and pulled it towards herself. It was heavy, incredibly heavy, but the adrenaline boiling in her blood gave her strength. She dragged the free end of the chain to the edge of the platform. Now came the hardest part. She needed to wrap it around the lower, stationary shaft, and then throw the loop onto the upper one that was spinning. If she erred by even a second, the chain would wind her up with it and tear her to pieces. Come on, Granger, she hissed through clenched teeth. You survived a war. You survived potions exams with Snape. You can handle some scrap metal. She took a deep breath of air that smelled of ozone and overheated grease. 1. She jumped onto the stationary lower shaft, balancing on the slippery metal. Quickly, before she lost her balance, she wrapped the chain around the axle, securing it on a protruding bolt. 2. She raised her head. The upper shaft hummed above her like an angry swarm of hornets. She took the heavy end of the chain with the hook. She needed to throw it so that the hook caught on an opening in the flange of the upper shaft. It was like trying to thread a needle during an earthquake. The house shuddered, the wall to her left cracked, and a pile of old pocket watches spilled out from it, raining down into the abyss. Time was no more. Hermione spun the end of the chain above her head like a lasso. Engorgio, she shouted, pointing her wand at the hook at the moment of the throw to increase its weight and the chance of catching. The hook flew upward. Clang! It struck the metal, striking a shower of sparks, slid along the surface, and caught. Depulso! Hermione pushed off the shaft with magic, flying back onto the platform. At that same moment, the chain pulled taut. The sound was terrible. It wasn't just a screech, it was the scream of metal being forced to work against its will. The chain strained, becoming rigid as a rod. The jerk was of such force that the entire house tilted a few degrees, like a ship in a storm. The lower shaft shuddered. It resisted. Rust and time held it firmly, but the energy of the upper shaft, transmitted through the chain, was relentless. Crack! The sound of a broken seal. The lower shaft began to rotate. At first slowly, in jerks, and then faster and faster, synchronizing with the upper one. Hermione lay on the floor of the platform, covering her head with her arms, while a hurricane of sparks and metal debris raged above her. The mechanism started working. The heart of the house began pumping time again, but something was wrong. Hermione felt it with her back, with her skin. The rhythm was incorrect. Instead of a measured tick-tock, the house began to vibrate, with a small, hysterical tremor. Tick-tick-tick-tick, she raised her head. The chain she had installed glowed red-hot from friction. It wasn't just transmitting motion. It was transmitting accumulated compression energy. All those seconds, minutes, and hours that the house had compressed within itself while the mechanism stood still, were now being released simultaneously. It wasn't a flow of time. It was a flood. "Oh no," Hermione whispered, getting to her feet. She looked down into the abyss. Where there had been darkness, a blinding white light now pulsed. It was rising, flooding the levels one by one. It was raw time, unfiltered entropy. If it touched a human, they would age and turn to dust in a split second, or turn into an infant and vanish. Hermione realized her mistake. She had restored the mechanism, but hadn't regulated it. She had opened the dam without checking the sluices. Now she had only one place left to hide, and ironically, it was the only place where she could stop everything. Inside the grand clock itself. She remembered the diagram she had seen on the table in the archive. Inside the main casing of the clock was a room of silence, a technical capsule for the master, protected from the effects of time streams so that the clockmaker could work on the mechanism from the inside without aging. The spring, the source of energy, was located there too. The white light was rising. The stairs had already vanished into it, crumbling into atoms. Hermione ran, not to the exit. The exit no longer existed. She ran to the maintenance hatch leading inside the giant dial. Her path was blocked by a burst pipe spitting a jet of hot steam. Hermione jumped over it without even slowing down. Her hair was disheveled, there was an abrasion from a metal splinter on her cheek, and her clothes were covered in grease. She looked not like the Minister for Magic, but like a warrior going into her last battle. She reached the hatch. It had a valve in the shape of a lion's head. She grabbed it. Hot. Turned it, rusted shut. "Reducto," she barked, having no time for delicacy. The hinges exploded, and the heavy cast-iron lid flew aside, nearly knocking her off her feet. Cold and silence poured from the opening. Absolute silence. Hermione glanced back. The white light was already licking the edge of the platform she stood on. Her boot began to smoke. The leather was aging, covering in cracks. She hesitated no longer. Hermione Granger took a step into the darkness, inside the mechanism, allowing the iron maw of the grand clock to swallow her whole. Hermione landed hard on the cold metal floor, and the first thing that struck her was the silence. Outside the walls of this capsule, a hurricane of time raged, tearing reality to shreds. But here, in the heart of the grand clock, absolute, vacuum-like peace reigned. It was like being in the eye of a cyclone, or inside a deep-sea bathysphere. She slowly got to her feet, brushing the dust of centuries from her clothes. The light here was soft, amber, emanating not from lamps, but from the brass itself with which the walls were lined. This space, the Chamber of Silence, was tiny, no larger than a train compartment. There were no windows, only a multitude of dials on the walls, their hands spinning madly, recording the collapse taking place outside. But the center of the room was occupied, not by a desk or a chair. The spring was there. It was not merely a machine part. It was a massive spiral of dark, almost black metal that took up a good half of the space. It was compressed to the limit, wound so tightly that the air around it vibrated, creating a low hum felt in the teeth. Levers and gears extended from the spring, disappearing into the walls, transmitting this colossal tension outward to the clock hands. Hermione stepped closer, feeling the hair on her arm stand up from static electricity. "Here it is," she whispered. "The source." The spring was not static. It pulsed. The dark metal would dim, then flare with an inner crimson light, like glowing coal. And within this pulsation, there was a rhythm. The rhythm of a human heart beating in a state of panic. Hermione realized she was looking at the materialized emotion of Barnaby Tock. In magical mechanics there is a law. Any object created with great passion adopts a part of its creator's soul. Barnaby had put more than just craftsmanship into this clock. He had put his remorse into it. His unbearable desire to fix everything. This spring was wound by his pain. His refusal to accept reality. It held the entire house in tension, not allowing time to move forward, forcing it to coil into a loop. "You are holding on to the past," Hermione said, addressing the mechanism. "You are wound to the breaking point because you fear that if you relax, you will lose her forever." The spring responded with a flare. A wave of mental energy struck Hermione in the chest, making her stagger. Images flashed before her eyes, not her own, but Barnaby's. A hand slipping from fingers under the water. An empty chair by the fireplace. The silence in the house that drives one mad. The thought, if only I had delayed her for 5 minutes. "I know," Hermione said softly, overcoming the pressure of another's grief. "It hurts. It is the worst pain in the world. But it is a trap." She took a step forward. She needed to release the mechanism. Outside the house, the gears were already turning because she had connected the shafts, but the spring was still trying to pull them back, creating a conflict that was tearing the very fabric of the house apart. To save herself, she needed not just to make the clock run. She needed to make it let go. She drew her wand. "Relatio," she uttered, aiming the beam at the spring's catch. The spell struck the metal but slid off like water from greasy feathers. The spring was tempered by the magic of despair. Simple charms had no effect here. It was protected by the strongest shield. Human stubbornness. Hermione lowered her wand. Engineering was needed here. She examined the retention mechanism. The spring was held by a huge ratchet, a toothed wheel with a pawl that prevented it from unwinding. The pawl looked like an iron finger clutching the wheel in a death grip. To release the spring, the pawl had to be knocked out, but the pressure on it was such thousands of tons of magical pressure that no physical force could move it. Unless, Hermione narrowed her eyes. She remembered the principle of a lightning rod. Energy cannot be destroyed, but it can be redirected. She looked at her hands. She still felt the phantom cold from Eleanor's key, which she had lost on the scales. That key was a symbol of memory. And this spring was a symbol of regret. Memory is light, regret is a burden. "Barnaby," she said loudly. "You wanted to turn back time to fix a mistake. But you cannot fix death. You can only accept it." She approached the spring closely. The heat from it was unbearable. Hermione placed her hand on the pawl. It vibrated. She closed her eyes and did something she had never done in charms class. She opened her mind to the magic of the house. Instead of building a mental shield, occlumency, she allowed the mechanism's emotions to enter her. She felt all the despair that had accumulated here for years. And in response, she offered her own experience. She remembered wiping her parents' memories. The moment their eyes went blank, when they forgot they had a daughter. She remembered wishing she could undo it all. How she wanted to scream and turn back time. But she hadn't. She had moved on. She had accepted that pain as the price for their lives. "Let go," she whispered, transmitting this memory, this feeling of acceptance directly into the metal of the paw. It is not betrayal to live on. It is the only way to honor those who are gone. The metal under her hand changed temperature. From scorching hot, it became ice cold. The pall, held by Barnaby's willpower, felt resonance with Hermione's will. And in that will was a truth Barnaby could not admit to himself. Click! The sound was dry and short. The pall jumped up. "Protego Maxima!" Hermione screamed, leaping back and creating the most powerful shield she was capable of. The spring snapped. The shockwave was of such force that Hermione felt as if a giant had struck her. The magical shield Protego Maxima withstood the direct hit of unleashed entropy, but physical inertia had not been cancelled. She was thrown backward, and she hit her back painfully against the opposite wall of the capsule. Her ears rang, and her vision went dark from a flash brighter than 1,000 suns. And then the world around her began to age. It happened with terrible, unnatural speed. A second ago, the walls of the Chamber of Silence shone with polished brass. Now, right before Hermione's eyes, the metal dimmed, covered in dark spots, and then a thick layer of green patina. The smooth surface became rough, eaten by corrosion. The giant spring, which had just exploded with movement, now lay on the floor as an unwound, dead snake. It no longer glowed with the crimson fire of regret. It was simply a piece of old, rusty iron, crumbling into flakes from the slightest vibration. Hermione coughed. The air in the capsule, which a moment ago had been sterile, was now thick and musty, filled with the smell of rot and ancient dust. "Time has caught up with us," she croaked, getting to her feet. Her clothes were intact. The shield magic had protected the fabric, but she felt as if she had aged 10 years in 1 minute. Fatigue settled on her shoulders like a lead weight, but there was no time to rest. The capsule began to vibrate. Now that the heart had stopped, or rather died, the grand clock had lost its integrity. It was no longer a magical artifact holding reality together. It had become a simple pile of scrap metal suspended 50 feet high in a building that was rapidly collapsing. Hermione rushed to the exit. The hinges of the hatch, which she had blown off with a spell, had now completely rotted and fallen off. The cast iron lid lay on the floor, turned into a pile of brown powder. She looked outside. The scene that opened up to her was apocalyptic. The workshop was gone. Instead of the majestic Cathedral of Mechanics, a ruin lay before her. Huge gears that had previously shone with silver now hung on twisted beams, covered in a thick layer of rust. Wooden scaffolds had rotted and collapsed into the abyss. The glass roof, through which the sky had not been visible before, now gaped with holes, and through them a real living snowstorm burst inside. The sound had changed. Instead of rhythmic ticking, the house moaned. Beams cracked, walls settled. Gravity, previously controlled by magic, reclaimed its rights, and now ruthlessly pulled everything down. Hermione stood on a narrow ledge near the entrance to the clock mechanism. There was no way back. The catwalk she had come on had fallen long ago. Below, in the darkness, something rumbled. Floors were falling. "Accio broom!" she shouted in desperation, though she knew there were no brooms in the house. Nothing happened. She needed to get down. Jumping was suicide. The height was too great, and the bottom was cluttered with sharp debris. Levitation. In conditions of such chaotic magical background, when the very air sparked with remnants of time paradoxes, levitation charms could work unpredictably. For instance, slamming her into the ceiling or smearing her against the wall. Suddenly she heard a grinding sound overhead. A huge chain, the same one that held one of the clockweights, had rusted through at the attachment point. It began to slide down, gaining speed. It was a one-way elevator. Hermione didn't hesitate. As a heavy link flew past her, she jumped and grabbed onto it. Rust bit into her palms even through the sleeve of her cloak, which she had managed to snatch with magic somewhere along the way, though she didn't remember when. The jerk nearly dislocated her shoulders. She flew down along with the chain. The wind whistled in her ears, mixing with snow and dust. Remnants of floors flew past her. A library where books had turned to dust. A study where furniture crumbled into powder. The house was dying. It was living 100 years in a minute. Hermione saw the chain below ending in a huge cast iron weight, flying straight into a pile of debris on the ground floor. "Need to break," she shouted to herself. She drew her wand, holding onto the chain with one hand, and pointed it at the wall flying past. Arresto momentum. The spell hit not the chain, that would have been too abrupt, but the air around her, creating a cushion of resistance. The speed of the fall decreased, but not enough. The weight below crashed into the floor with a roar, smashing through the basement ceiling. The chain jerked. Hermione was torn from the link. She flew head over heels, instinctively tucking into a roll. The impact was hard. She landed on a pile of old, moldy drapes which softened the fall. But the air was knocked out of her lungs anyway. She rolled across the floor, knocking debris aside with her elbows, and stopped, crashing into the remains of a sofa. A minute of silence. Only heavy, raspy breathing and the pounding of her own heart. "Alive," she stated, wiggling her fingers and toes. Everything hurt, but her bones seemed intact. Hermione raised her head. She was in the main hall. That shining, clock-filled hall was no more. Wallpaper hung in tatters, like the skin of a corpse. The floor was rotted. The stairs to the second floor had collapsed. The fireplace was cold and dark, clogged with debris. But there was an exit. The massive doors were gone. Instead, there was an empty opening through which snow was sweeping inside. Real snow, real wind, real night. Hermione tried to stand, and then her gaze fell on something at the foot of the ruined stairs. A ghost stood there. But it wasn't a recording, not an echo. It was a real soul, freeing itself. Barnaby Tock. He looked old, as he had been at the moment of death. His back was hunched, but his face was peaceful. For the first time in the entire history of this house, he was smiling. He wasn't looking at Hermione. He was looking somewhere through the walls, to where, by the logic of things, the Black Lake should be. Next to him, another translucent figure materialized. A woman in an old-fashioned dress. Eleanor. She held out her hand to him. Barnaby took it. They said not a word. They simply dissolved into the frosty air, turning into a light, silvery mist that the wind instantly scattered. "Rest in peace," Hermione whispered. Her voice trembled, and a tear rolled down her cheek. Not from pain, but from catharsis. But the house wasn't finished yet. The frame of the building, deprived of magical support, emitted a final, pitiful groan. The roof began to fold inward. Hermione scrambled to her feet. Adrenaline hit her blood again. "Run!" She bolted for the exit. Her feet sank into piles of rubbish, the floor sagging beneath her boots. A rumble sounded from behind. The tower with the grand clock collapsed, burying everything that remained of the master's ambitions. Hermione leaped through the doorway the very second the hall ceiling fell onto the spot where she had just stood. She fell into the snow. Cold, wet, deep snow. She rolled over, covering her head with her arms, expecting the impact of debris. But there was none. The house folded inward like a house of cards, raising a cloud of dust into the sky, which the blizzard instantly caught. Hermione lay on her back, looking up at the sky. There, overhead, hung a full moon. Clouds raced across the sky. Time was passing, second by second, minute by minute. No one was trying to detain them. No one was trying to turn them back. She took a deep breath of frosty air. It smelled of pine needles and freedom. No smell of grease. No ozone. She felt the cold seeping under her clothes, and it was the best feeling in the world. It meant she was alive, and that the laws of nature were working correctly again. Hermione sat up slowly. Her hands were black with soot, her face scratched, her hair resembling a crow's nest, but the same strength shone in her eyes that had once helped her win a war. She looked at the pile of ruins left of the House of Frozen Seconds. Now it was just a pile of old wood and stone, which snow would cover by morning. She felt for her wand in her pocket. Intact. Then she reached into her other pocket. There lay the crumpled sheet from Barnaby's diary. The paper yellowed and crumbled in her fingers. The only thing that remained was a tiny mechanism. A small gear, ordinary brass, without any magic. Hermione clenched it in her fist. "I will remember the lesson, Barnaby," she said quietly. "One cannot live in yesterday, but one should not forget it either." She stood up, brushed the snow from her cloak, and headed towards the gate. It creaked on rusty hinges, an ordinary earthly sound. The street of Godric's Hollow was quiet. Lights burned in the windows of neighboring houses. People slept, dreamed, woke up, aged, lived. Hermione walked out onto the road. She needed to get to an apparition point, return home, hug Ron and the children. Tell them. No, she wouldn't tell them about the horror. She would just say she got held up at work, and that she loved them very much. Right now, in this very second, she raised her wand, preparing to disapparate. "Home," she whispered, and with a soft pop she vanished, leaving behind only footprints in the snow, which the blizzard had already begun to cover. The soft pop of apparition sounded in the hallway of the Granger Weasley home. Hermione swayed, grabbing the wall with her hand to keep from falling. As soon as the adrenaline receded, a dull, aching pain in every muscle took its place. Her left shoulder burned, her knees trembled, and cold, wet clothes stuck unpleasantly to her body. Silence reigned in the house, but it differed from the dead silence of Tock's house. Here the air smelled not of rust, but of lemon furniture polish, and the remains of dinner. Hermione approached the mirror in the hallway, and barely suppressed an ironic smile. Staring back from the glass was not the Minister for Magic, but some vagrant witch who had forced her way through a chimney. Her face was streaked with soot, blood from a deep scratch had dried on her right cheek, and her hair resembled a crow's nest with wood chips tangled in it. Her cloak was torn at the hem, and her boots were covered in a layer of mud and ash. "Merlin, Granger," she whispered to herself in a raspy voice. "You look like you fought a dragon, and lost." She couldn't go into the bedroom like this. Ron wouldn't just wake up. He'd raise the entire Auror office if he saw her in this state. Hermione tiptoed into the bathroom on the ground floor, leaving muddy footprints on the carpet behind her. "Terjau," she whispered, pointing her wand at the floor. The dirt vanished. Closing the bathroom door behind her, she leaned against the sink. Her hands shook so badly she could barely turn on the tap. She washed her face with ice-cold water. The water running into the white sink was black. She washed away the soot again and again, until her skin began to burn. Then she brought her wand to her cheek. Episki. The skin knit together, pain replaced by coolness, but a red mark remained. The bruises on her arms and legs would have to be treated with salve. Magic would not be enough here. She took off the ruined cloak and threw it into the laundry basket, deciding it would be easier to burn it than to wash it. She took a quick shower, washing away the smell of burning, and changed into clean pajamas she always kept here just in case. Now she looked better, tired, with dark circles under her eyes, but at least human. She went upstairs, peeked in on the children. They were sleeping. This ritual was unchanging, regardless of where she was. Their peaceful breathing was the best medicine against the nightmares of the past. The bedroom was dark. Hermione slipped quietly under the duvet, trying not to wake her husband. She was still shivering, the aftermath of magical exhaustion. Ron stirred. He instinctively moved towards her, hugging her in his sleep, but suddenly froze. Even through sleep, he sensed something was wrong. He opened his eyes, inhaling the scent of her hair. "Hermione?" His voice was sleepy, but anxiety cut through it. "You smell of ozone and smoke." He touched her shoulder and felt her flinch in pain. "Are you hurt?" Sleep instantly flew from him. Ron tried to sit up and reach for his wand to light the lamp. Hermione put a hand on his chest, stopping him. "No light, Ron. It's fine. Everything is fine now." "You're trembling." He pulled her closer, sharing his body heat. "Where were you? Another safety inspection?" "There were complications," she replied quietly, burying her face in his shoulder. "Old house. Bad magic. But it's over. The house is gone." Ron was silent for a minute. He knew her too well. He knew that if she didn't want to talk details now, it was better not to press. He felt the scar from the healed cut on her cheek with his fingers, ran his thumb over it, gently and carefully. "Will you ever stop trying to save the world on your own?" he asked, without reproach, only with sadness and love. "It wasn't work, Ron. It was personal," she whispered. "I realized something important." She extended her hand and placed a small object on the bedside table, which she had been clutching in her fist until now. A brass gear glinted dully in the dark. "What is that?" asked Ron. "A reminder," Hermione replied. "That time cannot be turned back, and that we must cherish what is here now. Even if we are tired, aging, and sometimes in pain." Ron sighed and kissed the top of her head. "Well, we'll deal with the aging. For now, sleep. You're cold as a toad." He pulled the duvet up to her shoulders, creating a cocoon of warmth and safety around her. Hermione closed her eyes. The pain in her body was slowly receding, giving way to heavy, deep sleep. Outside the window, snow was falling, covering the tracks of her night adventure. The world continued to turn. Time moved forward. And for the first time in a long while, Hermione Granger had no objection to this movement. She simply allowed this second to end, so that the next one could take its place.